The blade trembled in Jackson Reed's hands as he cut into his wife's abdomen. Outside, the howling Montana blizzard smothered all sound, all light, all hope. Inside their isolated cabin, a single oil lamp cast grotesque shadows across the walls as Margaret's blood pooled on the sheets beneath her. "Stay with me, Maggie," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking. "Please stay with me." But the hemorrhage wouldn't stop. Jackson had saved hundreds of men on Civil War battlefields, amputating limbs by candlelight, extracting bullets while cannons roared. Yet here, in this moment, his skill was failing him. The baby had been breech. The midwife couldn't make it through the storm. And now both lives hung in the balance. Margaret's eyes fluttered open one last time. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her breath ragged. "Promise me you'll live, Jackson. Promise me." Her hand went limp in his. The cabin fell silent, save for the wind's mournful keen. Jackson Reed screamed into the emptiness of that winter night, but the snow swallowed his grief whole. 3 years later, Jackson stood at his fence line, watching the road below. Wyoming Territory, 1885. Another winter settling into the high country like an old predator, patient and merciless. His gloved hands worked mechanically, mending wire while his mind wandered elsewhere. He'd inherited this sprawling ranch from his uncle 2 years back, thousands of acres of good grazing land that had made him the wealthiest man in 3 counties. Wealth he'd trade in an instant to have Margaret back. Movement on the road below caught his attention. A rider with flame-red hair led 2 horses through the gathering dusk. On the second horse sat a woman, her dark hair partially visible beneath a travel-worn cloak. Jackson recognized his neighbor Silas Thornton, a surly private man who'd settled in the valley about a year before Jackson's arrival. Even from this distance, Jackson could see Thornton's roughness, the sharp yanks on the lead rope, the dismissive way he let the woman struggle down from the saddle without assistance. Something about the scene disturbed him, though he couldn't place why. Perhaps it was the woman's rigid posture, or the way she clutched a carpet bag to her chest like it contained her very soul. The pair disappeared around the bend toward Thornton's property. Jackson returned to his task, pushing away his unease. A man didn't pry into another's business out here. The code of the West was clear on that. 3 hours later, as darkness settled fully across the valley and the first snowflakes began to fall, Jackson looked up to see Thornton passing back along the road, alone now, leading an empty saddle horse. In the moonlight, Jackson could swear he saw dark stains on the saddle blanket. Jackson straightened, squinting through the gathering snowfall. The tracks from earlier showed where the horses had veered off the main road toward the old line shack, a dilapidated structure whose roof had collapsed 2 winters ago. Nobody used it anymore. Certainly not in a brewing storm. His stomach knotted as he watched Thornton's retreating figure. Something wasn't right. Jackson told himself it wasn't his concern. He had livestock to secure before the storm hit in earnest. He had no business involving himself in Thornton's affairs. But as he walked back to his cabin, the image of that empty saddle haunted him. By nightfall, the blizzard hit with full fury. Wind screamed across the valley, erasing every trace of hoof and wheel. Jackson stood at his window, coffee cooling in his hand, staring into the maelstrom of white. 2 horses out, 1 horse back. Those 4 words circled his mind like hungry wolves. "You going somewhere, Doctor?" "Reed?" Jackson turned from where he'd been packing his medical bag to find Ezekiel Zeke Turner standing in the doorway, snow-dusting his broad shoulders and gray-flecked beard. At 70, the former slave still moved with the quiet strength that had helped him survive a lifetime of hardship. His dark eyes missed nothing. "Just checking supplies," Jackson lied, then immediately regretted it. He and Zeke had never dealt in falsehoods. "Fine, yes, I'm going out there." "To find that woman," Zeke said. Not a question. Jackson nodded, adding a flask of whiskey to his pack. Outside, the storm howled like something alive and vengeful. "I saw Thornton ride back alone. The woman wasn't with him." "And you think she's out there in this?" Zeke gestured toward the window, where snow pelted the glass like tiny fists. "That old line shack won't hold against this blow." "I know." Jackson checked his revolver, then tucked it into his belt. "I can't just sit here." Zeke's weathered face remained impassive. "It ain't your business, boss." "Then whose business is it?" Jackson's voice cut sharper than intended. The words hung between them, razor-edged with the unspoken history they shared. Zeke had been there the night Margaret died, had helped bury both her and the stillborn child when the ground was too frozen to dig proper graves, had watched Jackson abandon his medical practice and retreat into grief for 3 long years. Finally, Jackson sighed. "I've failed once before, Zeke. I can't stand by and watch it happen again." Something softened in Zeke's expression. He moved to the cabinet and took down a lantern. "You ain't gonna make it far in this blow. Not tonight." "First light then," Jackson conceded. "I'll set out at dawn. Might be too late by then." "What do you mean?" Zeke set the lantern down and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "This ain't the first bride Thornton's brought around. Fourth one in 2 years." Jackson took the paper. It was a clipping from the Cheyenne newspaper, dated 8 months back. A brief notice about a woman gone missing from a stage heading west. "There are others," Zeke said quietly. "All mail-order brides. All disappeared after reaching Thornton's place." Jackson felt the floor tilt beneath him. "You think he—" "I don't think nothing for sure." Zeke's voice remained steady. "But I used to be what they called a finder on the Underground Railroad. I know how to track people who disappear, and I've been watching Thornton for a while now." He produced more clippings from various newspapers, each describing young women vanishing in different Wyoming and Montana towns. All shared similar descriptions of the last person seen with them, a red-haired man. "Jesus," Jackson whispered, the implications sinking in. "Why haven't you gone to the sheriff?" A bitter smile crossed Zeke's face. "Sheriff Wilcox? The same man who's been hunting partners with Thornton all last season? The same man who dismissed me as an old colored making up stories when I tried to tell him." Jackson ran a hand through his hair. "We need to tell someone. We need proof first," Zeke said. "And right now, there's a woman out there who might be alive, who might be proof." Their eyes met in silent understanding. Zeke nodded toward the window. "Storm might break before dawn. You get some rest. I'll wake you if it does." As Zeke turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Remember something to read. Sometimes demons wear human clothes, and they're mighty convincing at it." The old man's words hung in the air long after he'd gone, mingling with the storm's relentless howl. Jackson set his pocket watch alarm for first light. He lay down fully clothed on his bed, the same one where Margaret had died, and didn't sleep. Dawn came pale and merciless. The storm had blown itself out sometime before sunrise, leaving the world buried in pristine white silence. Jackson saddled his strongest horse, a sturdy bay gelding that could push through drifts up to his chest. Zeke provided a rough map to the line shack, though Jackson had a general sense of where it lay. "Be careful," Zeke warned as Jackson mounted up. "Thornton might circle back." Jackson patted the revolver at his hip. "I'm not looking for trouble." "Trouble has a way of finding folks anyway," the old man replied. The ride was brutal. Though the storm had passed, the temperature had plummeted, and the snow came up to his stirrups in places. Jackson's breath crystallized before his face, and his thoughts turned increasingly to the woman. If she'd been out all night in this cold, the chances of finding her alive dwindled with each passing minute. He found her where the wind had tried to bury her, collapsed against the line shack's door. One bare hand still clutched her carpet bag, her lips the color of twilight. The traveling cloak had torn somewhere along the way, and frost clung to her dark hair like delicate lace. For a terrible moment, Jackson thought he was too late. Then he saw the faintest cloud of breath. Jackson dismounted quickly, his boots punching through the crust of snow. He pressed his fingers to her neck, finding a pulse, weak, thready, but present. "Can you hear me?" His voice came out rougher than intended. Her eyelids fluttered. The blue of her irises was startling against her pale skin. "Please," she whispered through cracked lips. Don't let him find me." Jackson didn't waste time on questions. He wrapped her in his heavy coat, lifted her onto his horse, and swung up behind her. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, a fact that troubled his medical mind even as he calculated the fastest route home. 2 miles to his cabin, 20 minutes if he pushed hard. Halfway home, the woman suddenly stiffened in his arms. Her eyes flew open, wild with panic. She began to struggle weakly. "Easy," Jackson murmured. "I'm trying to help you." "I know who you are," she rasped, her voice barely audible above the creak of saddle leather. "You're one of them." The accusation startled him. One of who? The men who take women. A shudder ran through her thin frame. Please, just let me go. Jackson reined his horse to a halt. My name is Jackson Reed. I'm a rancher, and once was a doctor. I swear on my life I mean you no harm. She studied his face with fevered intensity, searching for something. Whatever she found must have been enough, for she gradually relaxed against him. Thornton, she whispered. He left me to die. I know, Jackson said grimly, urging his horse forward again. But he didn't succeed. By the time they reached his cabin, the woman had lapsed back into unconsciousness. Jackson carried her inside, shouting for Zeke, who appeared immediately from the kitchen. Together they worked with the efficiency of men who'd faced emergencies before. Zeke built up the fire while Jackson assessed her condition. Hypothermia, frostbite on several fingers and toes, dehydration, and something else. A darkening bruise across her cheekbone that had nothing to do with the cold. As Jackson removed her wet clothing, he noticed something that stopped him cold. A surgical scar across her lower abdomen. Not just any scar, but one made with a very specific technique. A Harvard technique taught by Dr. Harrison Harmon, one of Jackson's mentors. The slightly curved line, the particular way the tissue had been brought together, it was unmistakable. What is it, boss? Zeke asked, noting Jackson's expression. Jackson shook his head, continuing to tend to the woman. Later, he muttered. They worked in silence, wrapping her in warm blankets, elevating her feet, preparing hot broth for when she woke. All the while, questions multiplied in Jackson's mind. Who was she? How did she come to have a surgical scar that only a handful of Harvard-trained doctors could have made? And what did she mean by one of them? The woman slept for nearly 16 hours. Jackson checked on her regularly, relieved to see color gradually returning to her face. When she finally stirred, the winter sun was streaming through the cabin windows, casting long afternoon shadows across the floor. Jackson was replacing the bandages on her frostbitten fingers when her eyes opened. She jerked away from his touch, pressing herself against the headboard. You're safe, Jackson said quietly, keeping his distance. You're in my home. My name is Jackson Reed. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the medical supplies, the fire crackling in the hearth. Slowly her posture relaxed, though wariness remained in her gaze. Water, she croaked. Jackson handed her a cup, which she drank from greedily. When she'd finished, she handed it back, her movements cautious, like a wild creature expecting a trap. Thank you, she said finally. Her voice was low and cultured, with hints of an Eastern accent. For saving my life. Can you tell me your name? Jackson asked. A moment's hesitation. Abigail Forrester. How are you feeling, Miss Forrester? She glanced down at her bandaged hands. Better than I should be considering. You've had medical training, Jackson observed, not a question. Surprise flickered across her face. Yes, I was a nurse during the war. How did you know? The way you assessed your own condition just now. Your eyes moved in the pattern of someone doing a medical inventory. Jackson leaned back in his chair. What happened with Thornton? Abigail's face hardened. He advertised for a wife, I responded. When I arrived, he seemed disappointed. The second day, he took me to a doctor in town who examined me and told him I'd had surgery that would make childbearing difficult. Her laugh was bitter. Thornton said I'd misrepresented myself, that I was worthless to him. So he left you to die in a blizzard, Jackson finished, anger coloring his voice. He said God would provide, that if I was meant to live, I would find my way. Abigail's fingers clutched at the blanket. I don't think God had much to do with you finding me, Mr. Reed. To Reed, actually, though I haven't practiced in years. Her eyes sharpened with interest. A doctor? Where did you train? Harvard Medical School, served as a field surgeon during the war. Something flashed in her expression. Recognition? Concern? But it vanished before Jackson could identify it. You should rest, he said, rising from his chair. There's broth warming on the stove. I'll bring you some. Wait, Abigail called as he reached the door. The man who works for you, the Negro gentleman, is he here? Zeke, he's down at the barn tending the stock. Why? She shook her head. Just curious. He helped care for me? Jackson nodded. Couldn't have managed without him. A tentative smile touched her lips. Then I owe him my thanks as well. As Jackson moved to the kitchen, he felt Abigail's eyes follow him. There was something she wasn't telling him, something beyond the trauma of her abandonment. The surgical scar troubled him. Harvard's technique was distinctive, and few surgeons outside that circle would use it. He ladled broth into a bowl, trying to puzzle out the mystery of Abigail Forrester. When he returned to the bedroom, he found her examining a framed photograph on the nightstand, Margaret in her nurse's uniform, smiling beside him on their wedding day. Abigail quickly set it down. Your wife? Yes. Jackson set the broth on the bedside table. Margaret. She died 3 years ago. Childbirth complications during a blizzard much like yesterday's. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly. That must have been unbearable. Something in her tone, a depth of understanding beyond polite sympathy, made Jackson look at her more carefully. It was, he acknowledged. Still is some days. Abigail accepted the broth, but her hands trembled slightly as she spooned it. Jackson noticed her gaze repeatedly drifting to Margaret's photograph when she thought he wasn't looking. Were you a nurse in a hospital or field hospital? He asked, attempting to fill the silence. St. Elizabeth's in Baltimore primarily, though I served briefly at a field hospital near Antietam. She hesitated. After the war, I worked at an orphanage. That's quite a varied background. Life rarely follows the path we expect, Dr. Reed. Abigail set down her spoon. May I ask you something? Of course. Why did you come looking for me? You didn't know me. You had no obligation. Jackson considered his answer carefully. When I saw Thornton return alone, leading your horse, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Most men would have. I'm not most men. Abigail studied him for a long moment. No, she said finally. I don't believe you are. As Jackson left her to rest, his mind circled back to that surgical scar. There was a story there, one he intended to uncover. But for now, the priority was helping her recover from her ordeal. What he didn't notice was Abigail's hand slipping beneath the pillow as soon as the door closed, withdrawing a small folded photograph she'd kept hidden in her clothing. A photograph showing Jackson and Margaret Reed alongside a third woman whose face had been deliberately torn away. The next 3 days passed in relative calm as Abigail regained her strength. The frostbite on her extremities proved less severe than initially feared. She would lose no fingers or toes. By the 4th day, she was insisting on helping around the cabin, despite Jackson's objections. I'm not an invalid, Dr. Reed, she said firmly, taking a broom from the corner, and I won't be a burden. You're a guest, not a burden, Jackson replied, but he recognized the pride in her stance. Though I won't turn down the help. They fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Abigail proved herself capable in the kitchen, transforming Jackson's basic provisions into surprisingly flavorful meals. She moved through the cabin with growing confidence, organizing his medical supplies, mending clothes, bringing order to spaces that had known only bachelor neglect for years. On the 5th day, Jackson found her in the barn, speaking softly to his temperamental mare, a horse that had been nervous and difficult since Margaret's death. To his amazement, the animal stood calm under Abigail's touch. You have a way with horses, he observed. Abigail smiled, stroking the mare's neck. My father kept horses before he died. I practically grew up in a stable. Your father, what did he do? A shadow crossed her face. He was a professor of medicine at Yale, died of typhoid when I was 15. So medicine runs in your family. You could say that. She turned her attention back to the horse. Jackson leaned against the stall door, studying her. You know, for someone trained as a nurse, you have an unusually sophisticated understanding of surgical techniques. Abigail's hand paused momentarily on the horse's mane. What makes you say that? The way you've been reorganizing my medical supplies. The comments you've made about some of the procedures in my books. He paused. And the surgical scar on your abdomen. That's a very distinctive technique. Her eyes met his, wary but not hostile. You noticed. It's a Harvard method, specifically Dr. Harmon's approach. Not many surgeons outside that circle would use it. Abigail was silent for a long moment, her fingers working methodically through the mare's mane. The surgery was necessary, a complication from an injury. Before Jackson could press further, The sound of an approaching horse drew their attention. He moved to the barn door, instantly alert. Relations with neighbors were generally peaceful, but Thornton's actions had put him on edge. "It's Esther Hayes," he said with relief, recognizing the widow who taught at the town's small schoolhouse. "Probably bringing mail from town." Abigail retreated deeper into the barn. "I should stay out of sight." Jackson nodded, understanding her caution. "I'll come get you when she's gone." Esther Hayes was a handsome woman in her 40s, practical and straightforward. She dismounted with practiced ease, handing Jackson a small bundle of letters. "Thought I'd deliver these myself," she said. "Give me an excuse to check on you after that monster storm." "I appreciate it, Esther. Would you like to come in for coffee?" She shook her head, glancing toward the house. "Another time, perhaps. There's talk in town, Jackson, about Thornton's bride." Jackson kept his expression neutral. "What kind of talk?" "Thornton's telling anyone who'll listen that his mail-order bride ran off with $200 of his money. Says she played him for a fool." Esther's shrewd eyes studied his face. "But then yesterday he was asking Sheriff Wilcox what the law says about a man harboring another man's contracted wife." "That's so?" "Mm-hmm." Esther adjusted her gloves. Sheriff seemed mighty interested in the answer, too. Started asking if anyone had seen a dark-haired woman in these parts. Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Thank you for the warning, Esther." She nodded, remounting her horse. "You've always been a good man, Jackson Reed. Better than most in this valley. Whatever you're involved in, be careful." As Esther rode away, Jackson returned to the barn, finding Abigail waiting tensely behind a stack of hay bales. "Thornton's looking for you," he said without preamble. "He's claiming you stole from him." Abigail's face hardened. "That's a lie. I took nothing but what was mine." "The sheriff may come asking questions." "And what will you tell him?" Jackson met her gaze steadily. "That depends on what you tell me. I need the truth, Abigail. All of it." She held his stare for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Not here," she said quietly. "Tonight, after dinner. There are things you need to know." That evening, after a meal neither of them truly tasted, Abigail sat across from Jackson at the kitchen table. The lamplight cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to believe," she began. "But I need you to hear me out completely." Jackson nodded, pouring them each a small measure of whiskey. "I'm listening." Abigail took a steadying breath. "My name is truly Abigail Forrester, and I was a nurse during the war. But for the past 3 years, I've been working as an agent for the Pinkerton Detective Agency." The revelation hung in the air between them, unexpected and jarring. Jackson stared at her, searching for signs of deception and finding none. "You're a detective," he said finally. "Yes, specifically, I investigate cases involving missing women." Abigail leaned forward. "To Reed, I came to Wyoming deliberately to find Silas Thornton. Answering his advertisement was how I gained access to him." "Why?" "Because over the past 5 years, 7 women have disappeared after becoming involved with a red-haired man matching Thornton's description. In each case, he used a different name, a different town. But the pattern was always the same. He advertised for mail-order brides with medical backgrounds, nurses primarily, and they vanished shortly after arrival." Jackson's mind raced to process this information. "Are you saying Thornton is a murderer?" "I believe so, yes." Abigail's voice was steady. "I was hired by the family of his last victim, Elizabeth Winters, a nurse from Chicago. She wrote to her sister about her new husband, describing a man with red hair and a distinctive X-shaped scar on his neck." The image of Thornton flashed in Jackson's mind. He'd noticed that same scar when they had encountered each other in town. "The last letter Elizabeth sent," Abigail continued, "mentioned that her husband seemed disappointed she couldn't have children. She was never heard from again." "And you deliberately put yourself in his path," Jackson said, the realization dawning with horror. "You risked your life." "It's my job," she interrupted, "and these women deserve justice. Their families deserve answers." Jackson drained his whiskey, trying to reconcile the woman before him with this new identity. "Why are you telling me this now?" Abigail's eyes met his, unwavering. "Because I believe your wife Margaret may have been one of his victims." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. That's impossible. Margaret died in childbirth. I was there. I tried to save her. Did you examine the placenta afterward? Test for any unusual substances? What? No, Jackson stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. My wife died from hemorrhage. I couldn't stop the bleeding. Dr. Reed, Jackson, please listen. Abigail's voice softened. Before coming to Wyoming, Margaret worked as a nurse at Boston City Hospital. During her time there, 3 female staff members disappeared. All were last seen with a red-haired doctor who was briefly employed there. Jackson shook his head vehemently. This is absurd. Margaret never mentioned any such thing. And we never knew Thornton before moving here. We'd never even heard of him. Are you certain? Abigail withdrew a folded paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. This was the last letter Margaret wrote to her friend in Boston. It was forwarded to the Pinkerton office as part of our investigation. With trembling fingers, Jackson unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's, dated just 2 weeks before her death. Dearest Clara, I believe I found him. The man we suspected. He's living not 20 miles from our new home, under a different name. I haven't told Jackson. He would only worry, and after everything he's been through in the war, he deserves peace. I'll make inquiries carefully. If I'm right, this monster must be stopped before he hurts anyone else. If anything should happen to me, please continue what we started. The truth must come out. With love, Margaret. The paper slipped from Jackson's numb fingers. The room seemed to tilt around him as the implications crashed through his mind like a runaway train. This can't be, he whispered. She would have told me. Would she? Abigail asked gently. If she thought it would put you in danger? If she wanted to protect you? Jackson sank back into his chair, his world fragmenting and reassembling into a horrifying new pattern. You're suggesting Margaret's death wasn't an accident? That Thornton somehow poisoned her? There are substances that can induce labor and cause hemorrhage. They would be undetectable unless specifically tested for. Abigail leaned forward. Jackson, I need to know everything about the days leading up to Margaret's death. Every detail you can remember. But Jackson was already lost in memory, rewinding through those final days with agonizing clarity. Margaret's sudden illness 2 days before labor began. The strange tea sent by a concerned neighbor when she complained of feeling unwell. The unusually difficult delivery that followed. Oh God, he breathed. The terrible suspicion taking root. What have I missed? Abigail reached across the table, her hand covering his. We'll find the truth, she promised. And if I'm right, we'll make Thornton pay for what he's done. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Jackson Reed. The grief that had hollowed him for 3 years began to transmute into something harder, sharper, more purposeful. I need to see your evidence, he said quietly. Everything you have gathered on Thornton. Abigail nodded, relief evident in her eyes. It's all in my carpet bag. I'll show you everything. Outside, the wind picked up, driving fresh snow against the windows. But inside, a fire of a different sort had kindled. One that would not be extinguished until justice was served, or until it consumed them both. Jackson barely slept that night. After hours examining Abigail's evidence, newspaper clippings, personal letters, official missing persons reports, his mind refused to quiet. The possibility that Margaret's death had been murder, not tragedy, rewrote his entire understanding of the past 3 years. Dawn found him at his desk. Margaret's last letter spread before him alongside a faded photograph of their wedding day. The happiness in their faces seemed to mock him now. How much had his wife kept from him? What silent battles had she fought while he remained oblivious? You should have trusted me, he whispered to her image. We could have faced this together. A floorboard creaked, and Jackson looked up to find Abigail standing in the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders, wrapped in one of Margaret's old shawls. The sight stirred something in him, a confusion of loyalty, grief, and nascent hope that left him unsettled. You didn't sleep, she observed quietly. Neither did you. She moved to sit opposite him, her eyes landing on the wedding photograph. I would have liked to have known her. You said you knew of her in Boston. I knew of her work. She was highly regarded, but we never met. Abigail's gaze remained steady. Have you reached any conclusions? Jackson ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble of a day's growth. I'm still processing. If what you believe is true, if Thornton somehow engineered Margaret's death, then I've been blind in ways I can't begin to forgive myself for. Blame Thornton, not yourself, Abigail said firmly. Men like him count on decent people not recognizing monsters when they see them. I'm a doctor, Abigail. I should have noticed something wrong with her symptoms. The most skilled poisoners target symptoms that mimic natural causes. And you were emotionally involved. Any doctor would have struggled to be objective with their own wife. Jackson nodded absently, but self-recrimination still gnawed at him. What now? We can't exactly march into town and accuse Thornton of multiple murders without concrete proof. We gather more evidence, Abigail replied. I need to search Thornton's property. If he's killed as many women as I suspect, there must be traces somewhere. That's far too dangerous, Jackson objected. He's already suspicious, and the sheriff seems to be in his pocket. Before she could respond, they heard a sharp rap at the front door. Both froze, exchanging wary glances. Jackson motioned for Abigail to stay put as he moved to answer it. Zeke stood on the porch, snow dusting his shoulders. Morning, boss. Got a visitor coming up the road. Miss Hayes from town. Jackson felt Abigail appear silently behind him. Esther, what would bring her out again so soon? Don't know, but she's riding fast. Might be news. Abigail, you should hide? I think not. Her voice was calm but resolute. If Thornton is sending the law after me, I won't cower. But I will change into something more presentable than your nightshirt. She disappeared into the bedroom as hoofbeats approached. Minutes later, Esther Hayes dismounted in a flurry of motion, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. Jackson, she called, hurrying up the porch steps. I had to come immediately. She stopped short, seeing Zeke. Mr. Turner, good morning. Zeke tipped his hat. Miss Hayes, I'll see to your horse. Once inside, Esther wasted no time with pleasantries. Sheriff Wilcox is assembling a search party. They're saying Thornton's bride stole valuable family heirlooms and ran off. They'll be coming to search every property in the valley, starting with the nearest neighbors. When? Jackson asked, keeping his voice even. Tomorrow morning. Thornton's been shouting to anyone who'll listen that you must be harboring her. Esther hesitated, her eyes darting toward the bedroom door. Jackson, I'm not a fool. Is she here? Before he could answer, the bedroom door opened, and Abigail emerged, dressed in one of Margaret's old dresses, her hair neatly pinned. I'm Abigail Forrester, she said, extending her hand, and I can assure you, Mrs. Hayes, I've stolen nothing. Esther studied her with frank curiosity. I never believed you had. Thornton's reputation isn't as pristine as he'd like to think. What do you mean? Jackson asked. People talk, women especially. Esther's mouth tightened. There was another bride before this one. She vanished last spring, and Thornton claimed she'd run off with a cattle driver. But Millie at the hotel said the girl was terrified of him. Abigail and Jackson exchanged glances. Mrs. Hayes, Abigail said carefully, what would you say if I told you Thornton has done this before? Many times in different places? I'd say it confirms what I've suspected. Esther sat down at the kitchen table, her expression grave. And I'd ask what you intend to do about it. For the next hour, they shared a carefully edited version of Abigail's investigation, omitting any mention of Margaret's possible connection. Esther listened without interruption, her face growing increasingly troubled. If what you're saying is true, she said finally, we need evidence the sheriff can't ignore. Public opinion will follow the law unless we can turn it first. I was planning to search Thornton's property, Abigail admitted. Absolutely not, Jackson interjected. If he catches you there, he'll kill you outright. He'll be in town all day tomorrow, Esther said thoughtfully. Organizing that search party, it would be the perfect opportunity. Jackson stared at her. You're not seriously suggesting... I'm suggesting nothing. Esther rose to leave. I'm merely observing that Thornton will be occupied elsewhere, and his property will be temporarily vacant. She paused at the door. I should return to town before my absence raises questions. Good day, Dr. Reed, Miss Forrester. After she'd gone, Jackson turned to Abigail. You're not going to Thornton's place alone. Then come with me, she replied simply. 2 sets of eyes will be faster than one. Before Jackson could protest further, the bedroom door swung open violently. Abigail was on her feet in an instant, a small derringer appearing in her hand from some hidden pocket. Zeke stood in the doorway, his weathered face tight with concern. "Boss, we got trouble. Someone's been watching the house." "Thornton?" Jackson moved to the window. "Don't think so. Too small. Saw tracks in the snow by the south ridge. Fresh ones, leading away from that old oak where you can see the whole property." "Show me," Jackson said, reaching for his coat. Abigail tucked the derringer away. "I'm coming too." Outside, the winter air bit at their faces as they followed Zeke to the ridge overlooking the ranch. Sure enough, a clear set of footprints marked the snow beneath a gnarled oak tree, small prints, possibly a woman's or young man's. "They stood here a while," Zeke observed, pointing to the compressed snow, "watching the house. Then they headed north," Jackson noted, following the trail with his eyes. "Toward town?" "No," Abigail said quietly, "toward Thornton's property." A shared look of alarm passed between them. Someone else was involved, someone they hadn't accounted for. "Could be a trap," Zeke warned. "Thornton setting you up to catch you trespassing." "Or someone else investigating him," Abigail countered. Jackson knelt to examine the tracks more closely. Whoever it was, they were here recently. The edges of these prints are still sharp. As they returned to the house, the implications hung heavily in the air. If Thornton had an accomplice, their danger had just multiplied. But if there was another player in this deadly game, perhaps another victim or family member seeking justice, they might have an unexpected ally. That night, Jackson dreamed of Margaret, not as she appeared in her final hours, pale and bleeding, but as she had been in life, fierce, intelligent, laughing. In the dream, she stood at the edge of a snowy field, beckoning him forward, but each step he took sank him deeper into the snow until he could barely move. "Look beyond the surface," Dream Margaret called. "The answers are beneath." He woke with a start, dawn light filtering through the curtains. The dream clung to him, its message reverberating in his mind. Look beyond the surface. The answers are beneath. Pulling on his clothes, Jackson moved quietly through the house, pausing at Abigail's door. Soft, regular breathing told him she still slept. Good. Their expedition to Thornton's property would require all her strength. In the kitchen, he found Zeke already awake, coffee brewing on the stove. The old man acknowledged him with a nod. "Had a thought," Zeke said without preamble. "If Thornton's been killing women, where are the bodies?" Jackson poured himself coffee. "You think he's burying them on his property?" "Maybe, but digging graves in winter is near impossible with the ground frozen solid. Unless," Jackson's mind raced to his dream, "unless he has another way, a cellar or a cave." Zeke nodded. "Rebecca Martin lives on the east side of Thornton's land. Reclusive old woman, but she sees things. Might be worth talking to her before you and Miss Forrester go charging in." Jackson considered this. "How long would it take to ride there?" "Couple hours there and back, if you push. But you'd need to go now before Thornton starts gathering his search party." Decision made, Jackson quickly scribbled a note for Abigail explaining his absence, then saddled his horse. The morning air was crisp and clear as he rode out, the landscape transformed into a glittering white expanse under the rising sun. Rebecca Martin's cabin sat nestled against a rocky hillside, smoke curling from its chimney. As Jackson approached, a shotgun barrel appeared through a narrow window. "State your business," called a thin, reedy voice. "Rebecca Martin, I'm Dr. Jackson Reed. Zeke Turner suggested I speak with you." The shotgun withdrew, and moments later, a tiny woman with iron gray hair and piercing eyes opened in the door. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, but she carried herself with the tough resilience of someone who'd survived the frontier's hardships. "Ezekiel sent you? Come in then, before you freeze." The cabin's interior was surprisingly orderly, shelves lined with preserves and dried herbs. A large tortoiseshell cat watched Jackson warily from atop a rocking chair. "I don't get many visitors," Rebecca remarked, gesturing him toward a chair. "What brings a doctor to my door?" "Information," Jackson replied honestly. "About Silas Thornton." Rebecca's expression darkened. "That man is the devil himself. You've seen something?" She moved to the stove, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. "More than I wanted to. My cabin overlooks part of his property. 3 times now I've seen him in the night, carrying heavy bundles into that old mine shaft on his land." Jackson sat forward. "Mine shaft? from the silver boom 30 years back. Most folks forgot it's there. It played out quick and got abandoned, but it goes deep into the hillside. A cold certainty settled in Jackson's gut. These bundles, were they large enough to be bodies? Rebecca met his gaze unflinchingly. Wrapped in canvas, always after one of his brides disappeared. She set down her cup with a clatter. I told Sheriff Wilcox once. He laughed, said I was an old woman with too much imagination. Where exactly is this mine entrance? Northwestern corner of Thornton's property, tucked into that rocky outcrop. You can't see it from the main road. She studied him shrewdly. You're planning to look, aren't you? Yes. Be careful, that mine's unstable in places. And Thornton. She hesitated. He ain't normal, Dr. Reed. Sometimes I hear him talking to himself out there, laughing, and once, she crossed it herself. Once I heard a woman screaming from inside that hillside, screaming like the damned. Jackson left with precise directions and a growing sense of dread. If Rebecca was right, the mine shaft might contain the evidence they needed, but at what cost to those who'd already suffered? When he returned to the ranch, he found Abigail and Zeke in tense conversation at the kitchen table. Both looked up sharply as he entered. You should have woken me, Abigail said, her tone clipped. You needed rest. I needed to be consulted on our investigation. She stood, hands on hips. I've been doing this for years, Jackson. You can't simply... There's a mine shaft on Thornton's property, Jackson interrupted. Rebecca Martin has seen him carrying what she believes are bodies into it. That stopped her short. A mine? Are you certain? Rebecca's been watching Thornton for months. She's even heard... He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. She's heard screaming from inside. The color drained from Abigail's face. Then some of them might still be alive. The possibility hung in the air like a thunderclap. If Thornton wasn't just killing his victims but imprisoning them, perhaps experimenting on them, given his apparent medical background, their mission had just become far more urgent. We need to go tonight, Abigail said firmly. Not tomorrow. Tonight, while Thornton is still in town preparing his search party. Jackson nodded grimly. I'll get supplies ready. As twilight approached, they made final preparations. Lanterns, rope, weapons, medical supplies. Zeke would remain at the ranch to maintain appearances and intercept any early visitors. If they weren't back by dawn, he would ride for help, though who would believe him remained an open question. Remember what I taught you in the war, Zeke told Jackson as they prepared to depart. Sometimes you gotta be the hunter, not the healer. Jackson checked his revolver one last time, feeling its weight, both physical and moral. I haven't forgotten. As they mounted their horses, Abigail turned to him, her face half shadowed in the fading light. Whatever we find there, are you prepared for it? Jackson thought of Margaret, of her secret investigation, of her final painful hours, of the possibility that all of it had been orchestrated by the man they now pursued. Yes, he said, his voice hard as winter ice. I'm prepared. Night had fallen completely by the time they approached Thornton's property, a thin sliver of moon providing just enough light to navigate by. They left their horses tethered in a sheltered gully half a mile away, proceeding on foot through the snow-covered terrain. Thornton's house loomed dark against the starlit sky, no lamps burning in its windows. From their vantage point behind a stand of pines, Jackson and Abigail surveyed the property, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred except curls of smoke from the chimney. Could he have stayed home? Abigail whispered. Possible. We should check the house first to be certain. They moved cautiously across the open ground, keeping to the shadows where they could. The house was larger than Jackson had expected, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and several outbuildings. At the back door, Abigail produced a set of slender metal tools from her pocket. Lockpicks? Jackson raised an eyebrow. Standard Pinkerton equipment, she replied, already working on the door. Keep watch. Within moments, the lock clicked open. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a kitchen that smelled faintly of tobacco and something medicinal. Jackson lit a small bullseye lantern, shielding most of its light with his hand as they moved deeper into the house. The interior was unexpectedly well appointed. Quality furniture, oriental rugs, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes. Not the dwelling of a simple rancher, but of a man with educated tastes and substantial means. "Look at these," Abigail whispered, gesturing to the bookshelves. Medical texts predominated. Anatomy, surgery, pharmaceuticals, many in German or Latin. "Thornton has medical training," Jackson murmured. "Advanced training." They continued their search, moving from room to room with practiced silence. The study yielded stacks of correspondence, letters to and from medical supply companies, ordering equipment that would be unusual for anyone but a practicing surgeon. Upstairs, they found bedrooms, one clearly Thornton's, neat and austere, and three others that stopped them both cold. Each was set up as if awaiting a bride. Fresh linens, feminine toiletries, even dresses hanging in the wardrobes. But the thick layer of dust on everything suggested these rooms had remained untouched for months, perhaps years. "Shrines," Abigail said softly. "He keeps them like museum exhibits." In the largest bedroom, Jackson found a locked drawer in the bureau. When forced open, it revealed a collection of wedding rings, hair ribbons, and small personal effects, each labeled with a woman's name and date. "My God," he breathed. "There are at least 9 different women represented here." Abigail examined the items, her face pale in the lantern light. "More than I'd documented. He's been doing this longer than we realized." A sound from downstairs froze them both, the distinctive creak of the back door opening. They extinguished the lantern immediately, plunging the room into darkness. "Someone's here," Jackson mouthed, drawing his revolver. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the bedroom door, listening as footsteps moved through the lower floor. Too light to be Thornton's. Cautious, searching steps. Abigail motioned toward the window, their potential escape route. Jackson nodded, but before they could move, the footsteps started up the stairs. Heartbeats hammered in the silence as they waited, weapons ready. The footsteps paused outside the bedroom door, then slowly pushed it open. A slender figure slipped into the room, not Thornton, but a woman, small, wearing a man's coat several sizes too large. As she moved toward the bureau, moonlight from the window illuminated her face. Jackson felt Abigail tense beside him. The woman couldn't have been more than 20, with haunted eyes and hair that might once have been golden, but now hung lank and dull around her gaunt face. "Hello," Jackson said quietly, staying perfectly still to avoid frightening her. The woman whirled, a knife flashing in her hand. "Stay back!" she hissed. "I'll kill you if I have to." Abigail stepped forward, hands raised. "We're not with him. We're investigating him." "My name is Abigail Forrester. I'm with the Pinkerton Agency." The knife remained pointed at them, unwavering. "Prove it." "You're one of his brides, aren't you?" Abigail kept her voice gentle. "You escaped somehow." Confusion flickered across the young woman's face. "How do you, "Because I've been tracking him for months," Abigail replied, "documenting his victims, women like you who answered his advertisements." Slowly the knife lowered. "You're really not with him?" "No," Jackson assured her. "We're trying to stop him, to find evidence of what he's done." The woman's shoulders sagged, tension draining from her like water from a broken vessel. "My name is Emily Wilson. I was his wife last spring. He thought he'd killed me, but I survived. I've been hiding, watching, trying to find proof." "You're the one who left tracks near my property," Jackson realized. Emily nodded. "I've been watching you since you took in his newest bride. I wasn't sure if you were helping her or part of it." "How did you escape him?" Abigail asked. A shudder ran through Emily's thin frame. "He keeps them in the mine, locked in cages, uses them for his research. When he thought I was dead, he carried me out to bury me. But I woke up in the snow and ran." Jackson and Abigail exchanged horrified glances. "There are others still alive in there?" Jackson asked. "2, last I checked. Maybe more now." Emily moved to the bureau, pulling open the drawer they'd already searched. "I came for this." She withdrew a small locket. "It was my mother's. He took it when he brought me here." "Emily," Abigail said urgently, "we need to get into that mine. Can you show us how?" The young woman hesitated, fear evident in her posture. "He'll be back soon. He always returns at night to check on them." "All the more reason to hurry," Jackson pressed. "If there are women still alive in there, we need to free them before he returns." Emily seemed to steel herself, straightening her shoulders. "I'll show you, but we have to be careful. He has traps set around the entrance. As they prepared to leave, Jackson noticed something on Thornton's desk, a leather-bound journal. He quickly leafed through it, his blood running cold at what he found. "Abigail," he called softly, "look at this." The journal contained detailed notes on subjects, women identified only by numbers, descriptions of procedures, reactions to various substances, clinical observations of suffering recorded with detached precision. And in the earliest entries, a name that stopped Jackson's heart: Margaret Reed. The entry confirmed everything Abigail had suspected. Formula 17, administered gradually through tea, induced labor, catastrophic hemorrhage, all deliberately engineered to silence a woman who had recognized the monster in their midst. The journal slipped from Jackson's numb fingers. Abigail caught it, scanning the damning entry, her face paling. "Jackson," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." But Jackson was already moving, his grief transmuted instantly to cold, focused rage. "Let's end this," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "Tonight." They followed Emily out of the house and across the snow-covered property toward the northwestern boundary. As they neared a rocky outcropping, she motioned for them to stop. "Wire traps," she whispered, pointing to nearly invisible lines strung between trees. "Step over." "Oh, Carefully, they navigated the crude alarm system until they reached a narrow opening in the hillside, partially concealed by brush. A heavy padlock secured a metal grate across the entrance. "He has the only key," Emily said. Jackson examined the lock. "We'll have to break it." "That will alert him the moment he returns," Abigail warned. "We don't have a choice." Using a rock and the butt of his revolver, Jackson hammered at the lock until it finally gave way. The sound echoed alarmingly in the night air, but there was no going back now. They lit their lanterns and entered the mine shaft, the air growing increasingly cold and damp as they descended. The tunnel was roughly hewn, supported by timber beams that groaned ominously in places. After about 50 yards, it opened into a larger chamber that had been converted into a macabre laboratory. Glass bottles lined crude shelves, filled with chemicals and specimens Jackson didn't want to identify. A surgical table dominated the center, complete with restraints and drainage channels. Nearby stood medical equipment that would have been state-of-the-art in any hospital, much of it modified in disturbing ways. "My God," Abigail breathed. "He's been conducting experiments." "Human experiments." Emily pointed to a passage leading deeper. "The cages are that way." They followed her through a narrow tunnel that opened into another chamber. Here the lantern light revealed a scene from Nightmare. 3 iron cages built into the rock walls, each barely large enough for a person to stand in. 2 of the cages were occupied, women huddled in ragged clothing, their eyes reflecting the light like frightened animals. One appeared middle-aged, with streaks of gray in her dark hair. The other was younger, possibly no more than 18. "Help them," Jackson urged, moving toward the cages. "I need to check something." While Abigail and Emily worked to free the imprisoned women, Jackson returned to the laboratory, drawn by a terrible suspicion. Behind a canvas partition, he found what he'd feared: a burial chamber carved into the rock. 5 shallow graves, each marked with a small wooden cross bearing only a number. He knelt beside the nearest grave, his hand hovering over the disturbed earth. "Margaret," he whispered, "were you here? Did he bring you here after?" The sound of footsteps jolted him from his reverie. Abigail appeared at the partition, her face grim. "Jackson, we need to leave. Now. The women are in bad shape, but they can walk with help. There are graves back here. 5 of them." "I know. Emily told me." She touched his shoulder. "But we can't do anything for them now. We need to get these survivors to safety." Jackson nodded, rising to his feet. As they turned to go, a distant sound froze them in place, the unmistakable crunch of boots on snow, approaching the mine entrance. "He's back," Emily whispered, appearing behind them with the 2 freed women. "Thornton's back." They doused their lanterns immediately, plunging the mine into pitch darkness. In the sudden silence, every sound magnified. Their breathing, the soft whimpers of the rescued women, the steadily approaching footsteps outside. "Is there another way out?" Jackson whispered to Emily. "No, just the main tunnel." Abigail's voice came from nearby, calm and decisive. "We need to ambush him. It's our only chance." Jackson felt for his revolver, confirming it was loaded. Emily, take the women and hide in that side chamber we passed. Don't come out until one of us gets you. As Emily guided the trembling survivors away, Jackson and Abigail positioned themselves on either side of the main tunnel, pressing against the rough rock walls. The footsteps had reached the mine entrance now, followed by the sound of the broken padlock being examined. "Someone's been here," came a voice. Thornton's voice, cold and precise, with an educated accent Jackson had never noticed before. "Recently." A lantern flared in the tunnel mouth, casting long shadows as Thornton advanced cautiously into the mine. Jackson caught a glimpse of the man's profile, familiar yet somehow alien in this context. This wasn't the rough rancher who occasionally came to town for supplies. This was someone else entirely, someone calculated, dangerous. Thornton paused at the entrance to the laboratory, his lantern sweeping the space. "I know you're in here," he called, his tone almost conversational. "I can smell the lamp oil you used. And the fear. Fear has such a distinctive scent, don't you agree?" Jackson exchanged a silent glance with Abigail across the tunnel. She nodded once, readying her derringer. Thornton moved deeper into the laboratory, setting his lantern on a table. The light revealed he was armed with a revolver in one hand and what looked like a surgeon's scalpel in the other. "Are you admiring my work?" he continued, circling the surgical table. "It's quite revolutionary, you know, the effects of various compounds on the female reproductive system. Fascinating research, though acquiring subjects has proven challenging." His voice dropped lower, taking on a clinical detachment that chilled Jackson to the bone. "Your wife was particularly interesting, Dr. Reed. Such resilience. Most subjects succumb much faster to Formula 17, but she fought it for nearly 2 days. Impressive." The words struck Jackson like physical blows. Thornton knew. He'd been watching them, perhaps from the moment they entered his house. This wasn't an ambush, it was a trap. "Of course, I've refined my methods since then," Thornton continued, moving toward the passage that led to the cages. "My latest subjects have provided invaluable data I'm particularly proud of." He stopped abruptly, staring at the empty cages. For a moment, silence reigned. Then a low, ugly laugh escaped him. "I see. A rescue mission. How noble." Thornton turned, scanning the shadows. "I assume the good doctor is here? And perhaps Miss Forrester as well?" "My most recent acquisition, though disappointingly barren." Jackson's grip tightened on his revolver. They'd lost the element of surprise, but they still had position. He caught Abigail's eye again, signaling with a slight nod. "You know, Doctor," Thornton called, moving back toward the laboratory, "your wife mentioned you often during our sessions. She was so proud of your surgical skills. Said you had the steadiest hands in the Union Army." In one fluid motion, Abigail stepped from the shadows, her derringer aimed at Thornton's chest. "Drop your weapons," she commanded. Thornton smiled, seemingly unsurprised by her appearance. "Miss Forrester, I wondered when you'd show yourself." "I said drop them." "Or what? That little pistol has one shot. Maybe two. Do you really think you can—" The explosion of Jackson's revolver cut him off, the bullet striking Thornton's hand and sending the scalpel flying. The surgeon howled, clutching his bleeding fingers as Jackson emerged from the shadows opposite Abigail. "That's one question answered," Jackson said coldly. "Now drop the gun, or the next one goes through your skull." For a moment, Thornton seemed to consider his options, eyes calculating even through pain. Then slowly he lowered his revolver to the ground. "You're making a grave mistake, Doctor," he said, his voice tight. "My work is vital, revolutionary." "Your work is murder," Abigail replied, moving forward to kick his revolver away. "And torture. Science requires sacrifice." Thornton's face took on a fervent glow. "The knowledge I've gained will transform medicine. The formulas I've developed can control fertility, induce labor, prevent pregnancy. Imagine the applications." "At what cost?" Jackson demanded, his revolver unwavering. "How many women have you killed for your science?" Thornton straightened, a strange dignity overtaking him despite his injured hand. "You of all people should understand, Reed. You who cut and sawed limbs from screaming men during the war. Was that not also suffering in service to medicine? That was saving lives, not taking them." A matter of perspective. Thornton's gaze shifted subtly, looking past them. "And speaking of perspective, The warning came too late. A deafening report echoed through the chamber as a shotgun blast tore into the wall inches from Jackson's head. He dove for cover as a second shot followed, splintering rock and timber. "Sheriff Wilcox," Abigail breathed, crouching behind a cabinet. "He must have followed us." Indeed, the sheriff's bulky silhouette appeared at the tunnel entrance, shotgun raised. "Thornton, you in there?" Thornton seized the moment of chaos to lunge for his fallen revolver. Abigail fired her Derringer, the shot going wide as Thornton rolled behind the surgical table. "Here, Sheriff," he called. "They're trying to kill me." What followed was pandemonium. Wilcox charged in, firing blindly into the laboratory while Thornton retrieved his weapon. Jackson pulled Abigail behind a stack of crates as bullets and buckshot tore through the chamber. "We need to get to Emily and the others," Abigail shouted over the din. Jackson nodded, searching desperately for an opening. The lantern Thornton had brought was still burning on the table, casting wild shadows across the chaotic scene. An idea formed in his mind. "When I give the signal, run for the side passage," he told Abigail. "I'll be right behind you." Before she could object, Jackson took aim at the lantern and fired. The shot shattered the glass, spraying burning oil across the laboratory table and the chemicals stored there. Flames erupted instantly, racing along the wooden surfaces and licking up the support timbers. "Now," Jackson shouted, firing two more shots to force Thornton and Wilcox into cover. They ran for the side passage, bullets ricocheting off the rock walls around them. The fire spread with frightening speed, feeding on chemicals and dried timbers. Behind them, Thornton was shouting something about his research being destroyed. They found Emily and the two survivors huddled in the small chamber, terrified by the gunfire and growing inferno. "Fire's blocking the main tunnel," Jackson said grimly. "Is there really no other way out?" Emily looked stricken. "No, wait, there's a vertical shaft for air. Thornton sealed it from above. But if we could reach it—" "Show me." They followed Emily deeper into the mine, away from the fire but into increasingly unstable passages. The air grew thin and stale, and overhead, timbers creaked ominously as the fire's heat expanded the surrounding rock. There, Emily pointed to a narrow shaft that rose upward into darkness. "It leads to the surface, but it's at least 30 feet up." Jackson examined it quickly. "We'll need to climb. The timber supports form a kind of ladder." One by one, they helped the weakened survivors into the shaft. The older woman, who'd introduced herself as Harriet, went first, followed by the younger girl, Sarah. Emily followed, then Abigail. Jackson was about to start climbing when a voice rang out behind him. "Leaving so soon, Doctor?" He turned to find Thornton standing at the chamber entrance, clothes singed, face blackened with smoke, but eyes burning with an almost religious zeal. Blood dripped from his injured hand, but in the other he held his revolver. "The sheriff's trapped in the fire," Thornton said conversationally. "Unfortunate, he was useful." Jackson raised his own weapon, only to find it empty. He'd used his last bullets covering their escape. Thornton smiled, noticing Jackson's predicament. "It seems we have a final consultation to complete, doctor to doctor." Above, Abigail called down. "Jackson, hurry!" "Go," he shouted back. "Get them to safety." "Not without you." Thornton advanced slowly. "Your wife asked about my work, before I gave her the tea. Such curiosity. I almost considered taking her as a research assistant rather than a subject. But then she mentioned her suspicions to that friend in Boston and, well," he shrugged, "loose ends are so untidy." Jackson's mind raced, searching for options. The mine was growing hotter by the second, smoke beginning to filter into their chamber. Soon the fire would reach the remaining support beams, and the whole structure would collapse. "You won't survive this either," Jackson said. "The mine's coming down." "Perhaps. But I'll have the satisfaction of completing my work with you." Thornton raised his revolver. "A mercy, really. You've been half dead since your wife passed. I'm simply reuniting you." As Thornton's finger tightened on the trigger, a shot rang out from above. The bullet struck Thornton's shoulder, spinning him around. Abigail stood halfway down the shaft, her face illuminated by the growing firelight, a second Derringer in her hand. "I always carry a spare," she called to Jackson. Thornton staggered but didn't fall. With a roar of rage, he fired upward at Abigail, the bullet sending splinters from the timber beside her head. Jackson seized the moment to charge, tackling Thornton to the ground. The revolver skittered away as they grappled in the smoky chamber. Despite his injuries, Thornton fought with surprising strength. His medical knowledge made him dangerous. Each blow targeted vulnerable points, each grip aimed at arteries and nerve clusters. But Jackson had battlefield experience, and the cold rage that had built since reading Margaret's letter fueled every punch, every counter. She knew, Jackson growled as they struggled. Margaret knew what you were. She was hunting you. Thornton's laugh was more cough than mirth as smoke filled the chamber. She was an amateur. They all were. Women playing at detective games. He drove a knee into Jackson's side, momentarily gaining the advantage. None of them understood the importance of my work, the sacrifices necessary for advancement. Above them, timbers began to crack and groan as fire weakened their structure. Abigail called desperately from the shaft. Jackson, the mine's collapsing. With a surge of desperate strength, Jackson broke free of Thornton's grip and scrambled toward the shaft. He'd nearly reached it when something slammed into his back. Thornton, charging like a maddened bull. They crashed into the rough wall beside the shaft entrance, Jackson's head striking stone with enough force to send stars shooting across his vision. Through the haze, he saw Thornton reaching for a fallen timber, raising it like a club. I studied anatomy at Vienna, Thornton panted, his face a mask of blood, soot, and sweat. I can crush your skull with one precise blow. As he swung the timber down, a shot echoed through the chamber. Thornton jerked backward, a look of almost comical surprise crossing his features as he dropped the makeshift weapon. A dark stain spread across his chest. Abigail stood at the base of the shaft, empty derringer still pointed at Thornton's heart. And I studied marksmanship at Pinkerton, she said coldly. Thornton sank to his knees, then toppled forward onto the rocky floor. His final breath escaped in a soft sigh that might have been the name of some long-forgotten love, or perhaps just the last air leaving a monster's lungs. Come on, Abigail urged, helping Jackson to his feet. We need to climb, now. They ascended the shaft as the mine groaned its death throes around them. Timber splintered, rocks fell, and the air grew nearly too thick with smoke to breathe. Just as Jackson thought they might not make it, his hand broke through to open air, cold and sweet against his smoke-scorched lungs. They emerged into the pre-dawn gray, collapsing onto snow that hissed against their overheated skin. Emily and the other women huddled nearby, watching as the ground seemed to shudder beneath them. With a final thunderous groan, the mine entrance collapsed inward, sealing Thornton and his horrors in a tomb of stone and earth. It's over, Abigail whispered, her voice raw from smoke. It's finally over. But as Jackson stared at the ruined mine, he knew it wasn't over. Not for the women who'd suffered, not for the families who would never know what happened to their daughters and sisters, and not for him. The truth about Margaret's death had been revealed, but the wound it reopened would take time to heal, if it ever could. As dawn broke over the snow-covered hills, they made their way painfully toward Thornton's house. There was evidence to gather, authorities to contact, stories to corroborate. The journey toward justice, and perhaps toward healing, was only beginning. The first light of morning painted the snow-covered landscape in hues of rose and gold, a beautiful scene that belied the horrors of the night. Jackson, Abigail, and the three survivors trudged through knee-deep snow toward Thornton's house, their exhausted bodies driven forward by necessity rather than strength. Emily led the way, her thin frame somehow finding reserves of energy that the others lacked. Behind her came Harriet and Sarah, the women rescued from the mine's cages, their movements slow and uncertain after months of confinement. Abigail helped support Sarah, whose emaciated body could barely stand on its own. Jackson brought up the rear, his doctor's mind cataloging symptoms and treatments, even as his own injuries throbbed with each step. The house should be warm, Emily said over her shoulder. He keeps the fire banked even when he's gone. As they approached the main building, a realization struck Jackson. Sheriff Wilcox never made it out of the mine. Abigail's face was grim. No, and without him, we have no official authority here. We have the truth, Jackson replied, and evidence. That will have to be enough. Inside, the house was indeed warm, though the air retained traces of Thornton's presence, that peculiar blend of tobacco and medicinal chemicals. Emily immediately set about building up the fire while Jackson examined the two former captives more thoroughly. Harriet, the older woman, had been a midwife from Denver before answering Thornton's advertisement 8 months ago. Her body showed signs of repeated medical procedures, surgical scars, needle marks, and the telltale damage of prolonged malnutrition. Sarah, barely 18, had been there only 3 months but already bore similar marks of Thornton's research. He was testing different compounds, Harriet explained, as Jackson tended to an infected incision on her arm. Things to control women's fertility, to start or stop pregnancy at will. He called us his subjects, Sarah whispered, her voice brittle from disuse. Said we were contributing to science. What he did wasn't science, Jackson said firmly. It was cruelty masquerading as research. While Jackson tended to the women, Abigail methodically gathered evidence. Thornton's journals, correspondence, medical records, and the personal effects of his victims. She worked with the precise care of an experienced investigator, documenting each item's location before collecting it. We need to establish a clear chain of evidence, she explained when Jackson questioned the necessity. Without Sheriff Wilcox, we'll need to convince other authorities. Everything must be beyond dispute. By mid-morning, they had compiled a substantial record of Thornton's crimes. The journals provided concrete evidence of what they'd suspected all along, including additional details about Margaret's case that they hadn't known before. There's something different about the entry on Margaret, Abigail observed as they organized the documents. He seemed almost respectful of her intelligence. The others he viewed as mere test subjects, but with her, he recognized a worthy opponent, Jackson finished, his voice hollow, and that made silencing her even more important to him. The confirmation brought Jackson an unexpected sensation. Not the crushing grief he had anticipated, but a cold, clear purpose. Margaret hadn't been a passive victim. She had died fighting against the very evil he was now confronting. The confirmation both devastated and strangely liberated him. For 3 years, he had blamed himself for failing to save Margaret and their child. Now he knew that while he had indeed failed, the deck had been deliberately stacked against him by a monster wearing a neighbor's face. Around noon, Zeke arrived, leading a small contingent from town including Esther Hayes and Reverend Cooper, the local preacher. Their expressions upon seeing the rescued women and hearing their stories ranged from horror to righteous anger. The mine collapsed entirely, Zeke reported after a scout of the property. I spoke with some men who went to investigate. They found Sheriff Wilcox's badge and gun near what was left of the entrance. The recovery crew said the tunnel's too unstable to retrieve bodies, but there's no way anyone survived that cave-in. Thornton and the sheriff are buried beneath tons of rock. I spoke with some men who went to investigate. They found Sheriff Wilcox's badge and gun near what was left of the entrance. The recovery crew said the tunnel's too unstable to retrieve bodies, but there's no way anyone survived that cave-in. The county board's already appointed Deputy Grayson as interim sheriff until elections can be held, Zeke continued. They're going to seal it up for good once the federal men finish their investigation, added Reverend Cooper solemnly. Mark it as both a crime scene and a burial ground. And what of the other victims? Esther asked, her voice quiet but firm. The women who never made it out? Marshal Clayton's ordered a full excavation, Jackson replied. It'll be slow work, but he's promised every victim will be identified if possible, given proper burial. Their families deserve that much, at least. They're going to seal it up for good once the federal men finish their investigation, added Reverend Cooper solemnly. Mark it as both a crime scene and a burial ground. Good, Emily said with unexpected vehemence. Let him rot there. Reverend Cooper cleared his throat. Even the wicked deserve proper burial, Miss Wilson. Not him, Harriet interjected. If you'd seen what he did, Reverend, if you'd experienced it. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken eventually by Esther Hayes. What matters now is caring for the survivors and notifying proper authorities. The federal marshal in Cheyenne should be contacted. I'll ride there myself, Abigail offered. I have contacts who can help expedite matters. As plans were made for the care and transport of the survivors, Jackson found himself drifting toward the windows, staring out at the pristine snow that covered Thornton's property like a shroud. Somewhere beneath that innocent white blanket lay the graves of at least 5 women, including possibly Margaret. The thought that her remains might be here, on this tainted ground, filled him with a sickness that no medicine could cure. What are you thinking? Abigail's voice came from behind him. That there's no real justice for this, he answered without turning. Thornton's dead, Adrenaline dead, but so are they. All we can do is tell their stories. She moved to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his. Sometimes that's the most important part. Bearing witness. Making sure they're not forgotten. Jackson nodded slowly. Margaret was investigating him, trying to stop him. I never knew. She was protecting you, Abigail said gently. From what I've learned about her, that was her nature. I should have protected her. You couldn't have known. Abigail hesitated, then added, and you're helping to finish what she started. That matters, Jackson. He turned to face her fully then, seeing the exhaustion and smoke damage etched on her features. Despite everything, there was a quiet strength in her posture, a resilience that reminded him of what he'd once been before grief hollowed him out. You need medical attention yourself, he said, noting the burns on her hands and the cut above her eye from flying debris in the mine. Later, we have more pressing concerns. In the early afternoon, arrangements were finalized. Abigail would ride for Cheyenne with Zeke and Reverend Cooper. Emily, Harriet, and Sarah would return to Jackson's ranch with Esther Hayes, where they could recover in safety until authorities arrived. Jackson would remain at Thornton's property to continue gathering evidence and guard against anyone who might attempt to interfere with the investigation. As they prepared to depart, Abigail drew Jackson aside. Are you certain you want to stay here alone? This place, it holds so much darkness. Someone needs to secure the evidence, he replied, and I need. He struggled to articulate the complex emotions churning within him. I need time here, to process everything, to say goodbye, perhaps. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I understand. We should return within 3 days with the federal marshal. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small pistol, offering it to him. Take this, just in case. In case of what? In case we don't yet know all the players in this tragedy. With that cryptic warning, she mounted her horse and departed with the others, leaving Jackson alone in the house of the man who had murdered his wife. Night fell swiftly over Thornton's property, shadows lengthening across pristine snow like reaching fingers. Inside the house, Jackson had built a fire in the main hearth and set up a makeshift office at Thornton's desk, spreading out journals and papers in chronological order. The work kept his mind focused, preventing it from wandering down darker paths of grief and rage. The journals told a horrific story spanning over a decade. Thornton, whose real name appeared to be Dr. Edwin Blackwood, formerly of London's Royal College of Surgeons, had begun his research in England, where eventually the suspicious deaths of several female patients had forced him to flee to America. He had continued his work in Boston, then Chicago, and finally the Wyoming Territory, always staying one step ahead of suspicion. His goal, outlined in meticulous detail, was to develop compounds that could control every aspect of female reproduction, from fertility to pregnancy to childbirth. The practical applications he envisioned ranged from medical to monstrous, including weaponized versions that could render entire populations sterile. Most disturbing were his detailed notes on each subject. Reading them, Jackson could trace the progression of Thornton's methods, becoming more refined and deadly with each victim. Margaret's entry was particularly detailed, noting her medical background and describing how this made her both valuable and dangerous. Subject demonstrates unusual physiological resistance, perhaps due to her nursing experience and recognition of early symptoms. Implemented accelerated protocol after discovering her correspondence with contacts in Boston. Formula 17 administered in increasing doses via tea over 3 days. Successful induction of labor at 7 months, followed by catastrophic hemorrhage. Subject expired despite medical intervention from husband. Note: husband's psychological deterioration following procedure suggests additional research opportunity. The systematic destruction of medical professionals who pose a threat may yield multiple benefits. The entry confirmed Jackson's worst suspicions. Thornton hadn't just killed Margaret, he had planned to destroy Jackson as well, using grief as his weapon. And it had nearly worked. For 3 years, Jackson had abandoned his medical practice and withdrawn from life. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows in soft, insistent taps. Jackson rose from the desk, stretching muscles stiff from hours of hunched reading. The house creaked and settled around him, each sound amplified by solitude and the knowledge of what had transpired within these walls. Moving to the kitchen, he found a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a measure. Not for pleasure, but for the numbing effect he desperately needed. As he raised the glass, his eye caught a glint of something beneath the stove, a small object reflecting the lamplight. Setting his drink aside, Jackson knelt and reached under the stove, retrieving a small key attached to a leather cord. It matched no lock he had seen in the house, yet it had been deliberately hidden. A new mystery in a house already full of them. Jackson pocketed the key and returned to his whiskey, surveying the kitchen with fresh eyes. If Thornton had hidden one thing, there might be others. He began a systematic search of the room, checking loose floorboards, feeling along shelf edges, tapping walls for hollow spaces. Behind a loose brick near the fireplace, he found a small metal box. The key from under the stove fit its lock perfectly. Inside lay a stack of letters, yellowed with age, all addressed to "My dearest Edwin," and signed, "Forever yours, Catherine." The letters dated back nearly 15 years, documenting a love affair between Thornton Blackwood and a woman named Catherine Harlow. Their tone was initially affectionate, then increasingly concerned, and finally desperate. The final letter, dated shortly before Thornton's flight from England, contained a devastating revelation. "Edwin, the child is gone. The procedure you insisted would be safe has taken not only our daughter but my ability to ever bear another. The doctors say the damage is irreparable. I have told no one of your involvement. Even now, I cannot bring myself to expose you, though perhaps that makes me complicit in your madness. But know this, what you have become is a perversion of the man I loved. You speak of advancing medicine, but you have abandoned its most fundamental principle, to do no harm. I release you from any obligation to me. Indeed, I pray never to see your face again. Whatever path you walk from here, you walk it alone." Catherine Jackson sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. Here, perhaps, was the genesis of Thornton's descent. A procedure gone wrong, a lover lost, a child destroyed. Not an excuse for the monster he became, but a glimpse into the man who had existed before. The discovery lent a new dimension to Thornton's obsession with reproductive medicine. His experiments weren't just clinical research. They were a twisted attempt to master what had once destroyed his life, to control what had once been uncontrollable. As the night deepened, Jackson continued his exploration of the house, finding more hidden caches, money, false identification papers, and most significantly, a locked room in the cellar accessible only through a concealed door beneath a rug. This hidden chamber contained Thornton's most personal research, handwritten formulas, experimental notes, and jars of compounds labeled only with numbers. The walls were lined with medical texts, many rare or banned. In one corner stood a desk with a half-finished letter addressed to a Dr. Heinrich Müller in Vienna, describing a breakthrough in reproductive control agents and proposing a collaboration. The implications were chilling. Thornton hadn't been working in isolation. He had connections to other researchers, possibly an entire network of men conducting similar experiments. His death might end this particular chapter of horror, but the story continued elsewhere. Dawn found Jackson exhausted but determined, having compiled not only evidence of Thornton's crimes, but also a list of his contacts and collaborators. This information would be vital to authorities who might wish to investigate the broader conspiracy. As morning light filtered through the windows, Jackson finally allowed himself to rest, settling into an armchair near the fire. Sleep claimed him almost instantly, pulling him into dreams of Margaret, not as she had died, but as she had lived, laughing, determined, fierce in her convictions. In the dream, she stood in a field of snow, a red scarf bright against the whiteness. "You're doing well, Jackson," she said, her voice as clear as it had ever been in life. "But it's not finished yet." "What do you mean?" he asked. She pointed to something behind him, but when he turned to look, he found only swirling snow. When he turned back, Margaret was gone, and in her place stood Abigail, her expression grave. "There's someone else," Dream Abigail said. "Someone watching." Jackson woke with a start. The fire burned down to embers. Outside, the quality of light suggested late afternoon. He had slept most of the day away. Rising stiffly, he moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, a movement at the edge of the property caught his eye. A figure on horseback, partially concealed by trees, watching the house. Even as Jackson focused on it, the figure turned and disappeared into the forest. Heart pounding, Jackson grabbed his coat and the pistol Abigail had given him. Someone was indeed watching the house, someone who had not wished to be seen. Thornton might be dead, but his network clearly extended beyond him. Jackson hurried outside, following the tracks left by the mysterious rider. The trail led through a stand of pines and across a small, frozen stream before vanishing at a well-traveled road. Whoever had been observing the house was gone, at least for now. Returning to the property, Jackson reinforced the locks on all doors and windows. He spent the remainder of the daylight hours organizing the evidence he had gathered, preparing everything for the federal marshal's arrival. By his estimation, Abigail and the others should return the following day or the day after. As darkness fell once more, Jackson felt the isolation of his position acutely. The vast wilderness surrounding Thornton's property seemed alive with potential threats, whether real or imagined. He kept a fire burning and a lamp lit, the pistol never far from his hand. Sleep eluded him that night. Every creak of the settling house, every gust of wind against the window panes set his nerves on edge. By midnight, he had taken to pacing the main rooms, checking and rechecking locks, peering into the darkness beyond the windows. Just after 2 in the morning, a sound different from the others reached his ears, the distinct crunch of footsteps in snow. Jackson extinguished his lamp immediately, moving to the window with practiced stealth. Through a gap in the curtains, he could make out a figure approaching the house, small, feminine, moving with determination rather than stealth. Jackson positioned himself beside the front door, pistol raised, as soft knocking broke the silence. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more, a pattern unlikely to be coincidental. "Who's there?" Hawk called, his voice steady despite the tension coiled in his body. "A friend," came the reply, soft but clear. "I bring news of Thornton's circle." Jackson hesitated. This could be a trap, yet the voice carried a note of urgency that seemed genuine. "Step back from the door, hands where I can see them." He opened the door a crack, pistol ready, to find a woman standing in the snow, middle-aged, respectable in appearance, her hands raised as instructed. Something about her struck him as vaguely familiar, though he was certain they had never met. "My name is Eleanor Prescott," she said. "I worked with your wife in Boston. May I please come in? It's not safe to talk out here." Cautiously, Jackson admitted her, keeping the pistol visible as a warning. Eleanor removed her snow-dusted cloak, revealing the practical attire of a working woman, not wealthy but educated and composed. "You worked with Margaret?" Jackson asked, studying her face for any sign of deception. "Yes, at Boston City Hospital." Her eyes met his directly. "And like her, I've been tracking Thornton, or Blackwood, as we knew him then, for years." "Prove it." Eleanor reached slowly into her pocket, withdrawing a folded photograph. "This may help." Jackson took it, unfolding it carefully. His breath caught at the image. Margaret in her nurse's uniform, standing alongside 2 other women outside Boston City Hospital. One was unmistakably a younger Eleanor. The other's face had been torn away. "The third woman was Catherine Harlow," Eleanor said quietly, "Thornton's former lover. She joined our investigation after recovering from what he did to her." "The letters," Jackson murmured. "I found them hidden in the kitchen." Eleanor nodded. Catherine never stopped feeling responsible for what Thornton became. When she learned he had resumed his experiments in America, she dedicated herself to stopping him. "What happened to her?" "She got too close in Chicago. Thornton discovered her identity and—" Eleanor's voice faltered. "He made an example of her. That's when Margaret became involved. She and Catherine had become friends during Catherine's recovery at our hospital." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture larger and more complex than Jackson had imagined. "And now you're here. Why? Thornton is dead." "But his work continues." Eleanor moved closer, her expression grave. "Thornton was part of a network," it read, "physicians and scientists who share his beliefs about controlling female reproduction, who exchange research and methods. I found a letter to someone named Muller in Vienna." "Heinrich Muller, yes, one of several." Eleanor hesitated. "There are others throughout the country." "We should inform the federal authorities immediately," Jackson said. They'll need names, locations, anything you have. Eleanor nodded, but something in her expression gave Jackson pause. There's more you're not telling me. We need to be cautious about who we trust, Eleanor said carefully. When Margaret began investigating, she discovered that sometimes these men hide in plain sight, respected, even beloved community members. Like Thornton pretending to be a simple rancher, Jackson mused. Exactly. And sometimes, Eleanor's voice dropped lower, sometimes they're the very people we entrust with our health, those who have the perfect cover for administering their treatments. A memory surfaced, Margaret's pregnancy, her sudden complications. Dr. Samuel Wilson attended my wife, Jackson said slowly. He's Cheyenne's most respected physician. He prescribed Margaret special tonics during her pregnancy, said they were to strengthen her and the baby. Eleanor's face remained carefully neutral. Dr. Wilson is well regarded, isn't he? Trained in Europe, serves on the Territorial Medical Board. Yes, he was even at our home the day before Margaret went into labor, brought a special tea when she complained of feeling unwell. Jackson's throat tightened as the pieces began to align. Eleanor, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, she interrupted. But I think we should take a careful look at Dr. Wilson's patient records, particularly cases involving women who experienced unexpected complications. Jackson felt the floor tilt beneath him. Wilson, the kind, grandfatherly physician who had consoled him after Margaret's death, who had spoken at her funeral, who had encouraged Jackson to abandon his medical practice because some men aren't meant to bear such burdens. It can't be, he whispered, even as doubt crept through his mind. Eleanor pulled a folded page from her pocket, a letter in Thornton's handwriting. This was hidden in a different location. I only found it this morning. Jackson unfolded it with trembling fingers, scanning the contents. Most was in a coded shorthand, but certain phrases stood out clearly. W reports success with Formula 17 in controlled town setting. Greater dilution allows for widespread administration without detection. Recommend continuing, subject to MAR-BEM as planned. Oh God, Jackson breathed, the terrible truth settling over him like a shroud. Wilson and Thornton were working together all along. The question hit Jackson like a physical blow. Dr. Wilson had indeed attended Margaret during her pregnancy, recommending various tonics and supplements. Could he have been complicit in her death? I need to know everything, Jackson said, gesturing Eleanor towards a chair. Start at the beginning. As the night gave way to dawn, Eleanor Prescott unfolded a story that spanned continents and decades. A shadowy collaboration of medical men united by the belief that controlling female reproduction was the key to controlling society itself. Thornton had been merely one operative in this larger network, his isolated Wyoming location making it ideal for experiments too risky to conduct in more populated areas. What we didn't realize, Eleanor concluded, was that Margaret had identified Dr. Wilson as Thornton's local contact. She was building a case against both of them when she died. And Wilson still practices in Cheyenne, Jackson said, the implications settling over him like a shroud, where Abigail has gone to fetch the federal marshal. Exactly. If Wilson learns about Thornton's death and the evidence you've gathered, he'll destroy anything connecting him to these crimes. Eleanor's expression was grim. And anyone carrying that evidence. Jackson was on his feet instantly. We need to warn them. How soon can you ride? I have a fresh horse outside, but Dr. Reed, she caught his arm. Wilson is not alone. He has connections throughout the territory, including law enforcement. We must be extremely careful about whom we trust. Then we trust no one but ourselves, Jackson replied, already gathering the most crucial evidence into a satchel. And we ride like hell. And they departed at first light, leaving the bulk of the evidence hidden in a compartment beneath Thornton's floor that Eleanor had known about from Catherine's correspondence. The most damning documents, Thornton's journals mentioning Wilson and letters between the two men, Jackson carried in a waterproof pouch inside his coat. The journey to Cheyenne would take at least a full day under normal conditions, and the weather was far from normal. A sharp wind drove needles of snow into their faces as they rode, making conversation impossible and visibility poor. Jackson could only hope that Abigail and her party had been delayed by the same conditions, giving them a chance to intercept them before they reached Wilson's sphere of influence. By mid-afternoon, they had covered perhaps half the distance, their horses laboring through snowdrifts that sometimes reached their chests. When they came upon a small trapper's cabin, Eleanor suggested they stop briefly to warm themselves and the horses. "We won't make Cheyenne before nightfall," she shouted over the wind. "We need to conserve strength." Inside the abandoned cabin, they rekindled a fire in its small hearth and shared the provisions Jackson had brought from Thornton's house. As feeling returned to their extremities, Eleanor studied the documents they carried, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is far worse than individual murders," she said, tapping a passage in one of Thornton's journals. "Their ultimate goal isn't just perfecting these formulas for use on targeted women." "What then?" Jackson asked, though the sinking feeling in his stomach told him he already knew. "Mass application through public water supplies. Entire towns, counties, perhaps eventually regions." Eleanor's mouth tightened with disgust as she pointed to a map with marked locations. "These are test communities they have already begun experimenting on. Places where unusual fertility patterns can be attributed to harsh frontier conditions or poor nutrition." "They're playing God on an unimaginable scale," Jackson muttered, the true horror of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. "Deciding which bloodlines continue and which end." "Eugenics," Jackson muttered. He had read about such theories, which were gaining popularity in certain scientific circles. The idea that human evolution could be directed by controlling reproduction had a seductive appeal to minds that valued efficiency over humanity. "Exactly, and they're using remote Western settlements as test subjects." Eleanor pointed to a list of towns in Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. Places where unexplained fertility issues could be attributed to harsh conditions or poor nutrition. The scope of the conspiracy staggered Jackson. What had begun as a personal quest for justice, understanding Margaret's death, had expanded into something with national or even international implications. The research Thornton and his colleagues conducted could affect thousands, perhaps millions of lives if implemented on a larger scale. "We need to reach Abigail before Wilson does," he said, folding the documents carefully. "She'll know how to handle this, who to trust at the federal level." They continued their journey as daylight waned, pushing their horses as much as they dared through the difficult terrain. Night fell early, the overcast sky denying them even moonlight to navigate by. Eventually, they were forced to make camp in a sheltered ravine, building a small fire that they hoped would not be visible from a distance. As they huddled near the flames, sharing a blanket for additional warmth, Jackson found himself studying Eleanor's face, still seeking traces of Margaret in her expressions or mannerisms. They must have been close for Margaret to have joined Eleanor's investigation. "How well did you know her?" he asked finally. "Margaret." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Well enough to know she loved you completely. She spoke of you often, your skill as a surgeon, your compassion for patients." A small smile touched her lips. "And your stubbornness when you believed you were right." Jackson felt his throat tighten. "She never told me about any of this, about Thornton or the investigation. She wanted to protect you. You had seen so much death in the war," she said. "She didn't want to bring more darkness into your life." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "And she feared you might confront Thornton directly if you knew. She knew how dangerous he was." "Instead, she faced him alone," Jackson said bitterly. "Not alone, she had allies. But Thornton was cunning, and he recognized her from Boston when you moved to the territory." Eleanor's voice dropped lower. "That's why we sent Abigail after him. We hoped a new face, unknown to him, might succeed where Margaret had failed." "We? You and the Pinkerton Agency?" "The agency provides resources, but the core group is independent. Women who have been affected by Thornton and his colleagues, or who know someone who has been. We call ourselves the Vigilance Society." The revelation that such a network existed, women working in secret to counter the physicians' conspiracy, gave Jackson a glimmer of hope in the darkness. If Thornton's group could be identified and exposed, perhaps something meaningful could emerge from Margaret's death and the suffering of so many others. They resumed their journey at first light, pushing harder as they neared Cheyenne. By mid-morning, they encountered their first sign of civilization, a stagecoach heading west, its driver providing news that a federal marshal had indeed arrived in Cheyenne the previous day, accompanied by a woman and an older black man. "They're with the sheriff now," the driver added. "Some big investigation brewing, from what I heard at the depot." Jackson and Eleanor exchanged alarmed glances. If Abigail was already meeting with local law enforcement, She could be walking into danger, especially if Wilson had been alerted to their discovery of Thornton's activities. They pushed their tired horses to greater speed, reaching the outskirts of Cheyenne by early afternoon. The town sprawled before them, a mix of elegant government buildings and rougher frontier establishments. Smoke rose from chimneys and business was proceeding normally despite the recent snowfall. Where would they take the marshal first? Jackson asked as they rode down the main street. The sheriff's office, most likely. It's next to the territorial courthouse. They found the building easily enough, a solid brick structure with a territorial flag flying alongside the American flag. Tying their horses at a nearby hitching post, they approached cautiously, aware that they were potentially walking into hostile territory. Inside, the office was busy with deputies and clerks moving between desks. Jackson spotted Zeke immediately, his tall figure unmistakable, even from behind, as he stood at a counter filling out forms. Of Abigail and the marshal, there was no sign. Jackson approached quietly, touching Zeke's elbow to get his attention without creating a scene. The older man turned, surprise and relief washing over his features. "To Reed, we were starting to worry." He noticed Eleanor and his expression shifted to wariness. "This is Eleanor Prescott," Jackson said quickly. "She worked with Margaret in Boston. She has critical information about our situation." "Where's Abigail?" "With Marshal Clayton, meeting Dr. Wilson at his office." Zeke lowered his voice. "Wilson offered to examine the women we rescued, provide medical documentation of their injuries for the case." Jackson felt the blood drain from his face. "When did they leave?" "About an hour ago. What's wrong?" "Wilson is part of it," Eleanor interjected urgently. "He was working with Thornton." Understanding dawned in Zeke's eyes. Without another word, the three of them hurried from the sheriff's office, heading toward the affluent part of town where Dr. Wilson's practice was located. Wilson's office occupied the ground floor of a handsome brick building with a discreet brass plaque identifying him as a specialist in women's medicine and reproductive health. The windows were draped with heavy curtains, preventing any view of the interior. "Should we go in directly?" Eleanor asked as they surveyed the building from across the street. "Too risky," Jackson replied. "If Wilson is as dangerous as Thornton, he won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. We need to get Abigail out of there without alerting him." Zeke pointed to a side entrance. "Service door. Probably leads to a back room or storage area." "I'll try there," Jackson decided. "Zeke, stay out front and watch for any sign of trouble. Eleanor, find Marshal Clayton's men. They must be somewhere in town. Tell them everything, but make sure they understand the danger." They separated, each to their assigned task. Jackson circled around to the service entrance, finding it locked but not particularly secure. A few moments' work with his pocket knife, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of antiseptic and something more medicinal. Moving silently, Jackson followed the corridor until he heard voices from a room ahead. Wilson's cultured tones explaining some procedure, and a woman's response that wasn't Abigail's. One of the survivors, then. Where was Abigail? A door to his right stood slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, Jackson could see a portion of what appeared to be Wilson's private office. A figure was visible, Abigail examining something on a desk, her back to the door. She was alone. Jackson eased the door open wider, slipping into the room without a sound. "Abigail," he whispered. She whirled, hand going to her pocket where she presumably carried another derringer. Recognition dawned, followed by confusion. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" "Wilson is part of Thornton's network," he said urgently. "We need to get out of here, now." Abigail's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly. "I suspected something was wrong. Look at these." She gestured to the papers on Wilson's desk, patient records showing an unusual pattern of reproductive issues among local women. Too many miscarriages, too many stillbirths, all patients of Dr. Wilson. "He's been continuing Thornton's work here in town," Jackson confirmed, testing compounds on a larger population. "The marshal is with him now, examining Sarah. We need to warn him. First, we secure these records." Jackson began gathering the papers, their evidence. As they worked rapidly to collect the documents, a woman's scream echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by a man's shout and a crash. Jackson and Abigail froze for a split second, then raced toward the sounds. They burst into an examination room to find chaos. Sarah cowering in a corner, Marshal Clayton struggling with Dr. Wilson, who was attempting to inject him with something from a syringe. A medical tray had been overturned, instruments scattered across the floor. Jackson didn't hesitate. He charged forward, tackling Wilson from behind. The syringe flew from the doctor's hand, shattering against the wall. Wilson fought with surprising strength for a man of his age and build, his eyes wild with a fanaticism Jackson recognized from Thornton's final moments. "You don't understand," Wilson shouted as they grappled. "We're saving humanity, controlling who breeds, who passes on their traits." "You're murderers," Jackson grunted, struggling to pin the man down. "Playing God with women's lives." Marshal Clayton, recovering from whatever Wilson had attempted to do to him, moved to assist Jackson. Together, they subdued the doctor, using a length of bandage to bind his hands behind his back. "Someone want to tell me what the hell is going on?" the marshal demanded, breathing heavily. "Dr. Wilson is part of the same network as Thornton," Abigail explained rapidly. "They've been experimenting with chemicals to control female fertility, testing them on women throughout the territory." "Including my wife," Jackson added grimly, "and likely many others who never knew they were being used as test subjects." Sarah, still huddled in the corner, spoke up in a trembling voice. "He was going to inject me with something. Said it would document my injuries, but I saw the label. It was poison." Marshal Clayton's weathered face hardened. "Attempting to eliminate a witness under my direct protection. That's a federal offense, Wilson." Wilson's professional demeanor had cracked entirely, revealing the zealot beneath. "You're interfering with the natural order. The inferior must not be allowed to breed. We are directing human evolution toward perfection." "You're directing yourself to a hangman's noose," Clayton replied coldly. He turned to Jackson. "You say there are more like him?" "A network across the country, possibly international. We have documents naming names, locations, methods." Jackson gestured to the papers they'd collected from Wilson's office. "This goes beyond a few murders in Wyoming territory, Marshal. This is a coordinated attempt to control population growth among undesirable groups." Clayton's expression remained stoic, but his eyes revealed his comprehension of the stakes. "Then we better make sure these documents reach the right people in Washington." As they secured Wilson and prepared to transport him to the jail, Eleanor arrived with several deputies. Her eyes widened at the sight of Wilson bound and defeated. "You've done it," she breathed, "after all these years." "We've only begun," Abigail corrected her. "There are others still out there." "But we've broken the chain," Eleanor replied. "Without Wilson and Thornton, their network in this region is crippled." Jackson found himself strangely detached as the legal machinery took over. Deputies securing Wilson and the evidence, Marshal Clayton taking official statements, plans being made for a broader investigation. The personal justice he had sought for Margaret had expanded into something far larger, something that might save countless unknown women from similar fates. Yet amid the activity, a hollow space remained within him. Margaret was still gone. Knowing the truth of her death brought closure of a sort, but not the healing he had unconsciously hoped for. That, he was beginning to realize, would require something beyond justice or vengeance. It would require moving forward. A month after Wilson's arrest, federal authorities organized an excavation of the collapsed mine. It was slow, dangerous work, with engineers carefully reinforcing each section as they dug deeper into the hillside. Jackson insisted on being present, needing to know if Margaret's remains were among those buried in Thornton's macabre cemetery. "You don't have to witness this," Abigail had told him on the cold morning they began removing the first bodies. "Yes, I do," he'd replied simply. In the end, they recovered 7 bodies from the chamber Jackson had discovered. Through dental records, personal effects, and in some cases Thornton's own meticulous documentation, 6 of the women were identified and returned to their families for proper burial. The 7th, to Jackson's profound relief and lingering grief, was not Margaret. Her body had remained where he had buried her 3 years earlier, on the small hill behind their ranch house. "He must have brought her things to the mine afterward," Eleanor explained gently, "a trophy of sorts. But he never moved her body." This knowledge brought Jackson an unexpected peace. Margaret had remained under the sky she loved, not in that terrible darkness. The families of the other victims found a measure of closure as well, though for many, the answers they received only deepened their pain. Marshall Clayton ensured that each victim was treated with dignity, their stories documented as part of the case against Wilson and the larger network. These women won't be forgotten, he promised Jackson. Their deaths will mean something in the end. A week after Wilson's arrest, Jackson made his way to the Cheyenne Cemetery at dawn. The federal authorities had completed their grim work at the mine site, recovering and identifying the remains of 5 women, including Margaret. Though they couldn't determine with certainty which grave had been hers, Jackson had insisted on having a proper burial ceremony for all the victims. Now, standing before the newly placed headstone bearing his wife's name, he felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. The cemetery lay on a low hill overlooking the town, a quiet place surrounded by old pine trees. In the soft light of dawn, Jackson knelt before the simple white marble headstone engraved with the words, Margaret Reed, 1845 to 1882, beloved wife, courageous soul. He placed his hand on the cold stone surface. After all he had discovered, this grave was no longer just a symbol, but contained part of what had been taken from him. Maggie, he said softly, using the nickname he rarely spoke in front of others. You know, I was angry with you for a long time. Not because you left me, but because you didn't tell me what you were doing, the dangers you were facing. A cold wind swept through the cemetery, settling around his words. But I understand now. You didn't want to bring me more pain. You were always the protector, even when you were the one who needed protecting. He took from his pocket an old wedding ring, Margaret's ring, found among Thornton's collection of trophies. I see you in her, you know, in Abigail. Not the same person, but the same fire, the same determination to do what's right regardless of the cost. Jackson placed the ring before the headstone, his hand trembling slightly. I thought I couldn't love again, thought I didn't deserve to, and certainly not because I thought I could replace you. No one could. He paused, taking a deep breath. But I need to tell you that I think I'm finding a way forward, a path you would be proud of. At that moment, the first ray of sunlight pierced through the tree canopy, falling where he knelt like a warm hand. And I won't waste it, Maggie. I'll finish the work you started. I'll make sure men like Thornton and Wilson can't harm others anymore. That's my promise to you. He touched the headstone one final time, then stood. As he turned to walk away, Jackson felt a strange sense of peace, not an absence of sorrow, but the presence of something new beside it. A feeling he wouldn't call happiness, not exactly, but perhaps contentment. Not far from where he stood, a familiar figure waited. Abigail, wrapped in a cloak, her breath forming white mist in the cold air. I didn't mean to follow you, she said as he approached, but I woke and was concerned. No need to explain, Jackson replied, and they walked together in the strengthening dawn. Are you all right? She asked after a moment of silence. Jackson looked down at the awakening town below the hill, where they would soon build a new life. I think so, he said, his voice more certain than before. I think I finally am. Later that day, Jackson sat on the porch of his ranch house, watching the first stars appear in the twilight sky. The federal investigation had expanded rapidly, with marshals dispatched to San Francisco, New Orleans, and other locations where Thornton's network operated. Wilson had begun cooperating, trading information for the slim hope of avoiding the gallows. The survivors, Harriet, Sarah, and Emily, had been relocated to Denver, where they could receive proper medical care and be safe from any remaining associates of Thornton or Wilson. Eleanor had accompanied them, continuing her work with the Vigilance Society to identify and help other victims. Abigail remained in Cheyenne, coordinating with federal authorities and preparing a comprehensive report for the Pinkerton Agency. Her letters to Jackson were professional but warm, updating him on the investigation's progress and inquiring after his well-being. Zeke moved about the ranch with his usual quiet efficiency, restoring order to a place that had been neglected during their ordeal. Neither man spoke much about what had happened, but a deeper understanding had developed between them. The bond of those who had faced darkness together and emerged changed but undefeated. As Jackson sat contemplating the vast Wyoming sky, he heard the approach of a horse. Unusual at this hour. He straightened, hand moving instinctively to the pistol he still kept within reach. Old habits died hard. The rider emerged from the gathering darkness. Abigail, her figure unmistakable, even at a distance. Jackson felt an unexpected lightness in his chest at the sight of her, a sensation so long absent he almost didn't recognize it as hope. "Evening, Dr. Reed," she called as she dismounted. "Hope I'm not interrupting your solitude." "Not at all," he replied, moving to help with her horse. "I wasn't expecting you back from Cheyenne so soon." "The initial depositions are complete. Marshal Clayton suggested I might benefit from some rest before the formal hearings begin." She removed her saddlebags, looking somewhat uncertain, a rare expression for the confident detective. "I thought perhaps, well, there's still work to be done organizing the evidence. I could assist with that." Jackson recognized the explanation for what it was, a professionally acceptable reason for her return that didn't acknowledge the more personal currents flowing between them. "Of course, your expertise would be invaluable." They settled into a comfortable routine over the following days. Mornings were spent organizing documents and preparing testimony for the upcoming trials. Afternoons, Jackson returned to neglected ranch work while Abigail composed her official reports. Evenings found them sharing quiet meals and conversations that gradually expanded beyond the investigation to their personal histories, hopes, and philosophies. Jackson learned that Abigail had come to detective work after losing her younger sister to a fraudulent doctor selling miracle cures in Baltimore. Her medical training had begun as a way to protect others from similar predators, but had evolved into genuine passion for healing. In turn, he shared stories of his time as an army surgeon, of meeting Margaret during the war, of building their life together in Boston, and later deciding to start fresh in Wyoming. Speaking of Margaret became easier, the sharp edges of grief softening into bittersweet remembrance. On the 10th night after her arrival, they sat before the fire long after dinner had ended, a comfortable silence between them. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, adding to the sense of isolation and intimacy within the warm cabin. "I've been thinking about what happens after the trials," Abigail said finally, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Will you return to the Pinkerton agency?" "I'm not certain." She turned to face him fully. "This case, it's changed me, made me question whether detective work is truly my calling." Jackson nodded slowly. "I understand. After the war, I questioned whether I could continue as a surgeon. Too many men died under my hands, despite my best efforts. Yet you found your way back to medicine here in Wyoming. In a limited fashion, treating neighbors' ailments, delivering the occasional baby." He smiled faintly. "Until recently, I'd convinced myself it was enough. And now? Now I find myself remembering why I became a doctor in the first place. To heal, to make a difference." Jackson paused, considering his next words carefully. "The hospital in Cheyenne has been without a proper surgeon since Wilson's arrest. They've approached me about taking the position." Abigail's expression brightened. "That's wonderful, Jackson. You'd be an asset to the community." "I'm considering it." He hesitated. "And I find myself wondering what you might consider if your future plans remain unsettled." The question hung in the air between them, its implications clear yet delicately unstated. Abigail's cheeks colored slightly, but she held his gaze. "I've always valued independence," she said carefully, "the freedom to make my own choices, to live on my terms. As you should. But I'm beginning to understand that independence needn't mean solitude." Her voice softened. "That there can be strength and connection in building something alongside someone who respects your autonomy." Jackson reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "Abigail, I would never." A sudden, urgent knocking at the door interrupted him. They both tensed, the peaceful moment shattered by the intrusion. Jackson rose, moving cautiously to the window for a glimpse of their unexpected visitor. Through the snow-streaked glass, he could make out a small figure on the porch, a woman, or perhaps a child, bundled against the cold. She knocked again, the sound desperate rather than threatening. "Hello," called a female voice. "Please, I need help." Jackson opened the door to find a young woman, no more than 20, clutching a bundle to her chest. Her face was pale with woe and exhaustion, dark circles shadowing her eyes. "Dr. Reed?" she asked shakily. "They said you might help us." "Come in, quickly," he urged, helping her inside. "You're half frozen." As the woman stepped into the light, Jackson saw that the bundle she carried was a child, a small girl of perhaps 3 years, feverish and listless in her mother's arms. "She's burning up," the young woman said, tears tracking down her wind-chapped face. "Been sick 2 days, doctor. Wilson always treated us before, but they say he's been arrested, and no one else in town would help once they heard I'd been his patient. Jackson's doctor instincts took over immediately. He cleared the table, creating space to examine the child. "What's her name?" "Sarah. I'm Rebecca Thornton." The young woman's voice quavered. "No relation to that monster they found at the P9. Thornton's my married name." Jackson and Abigail exchanged startled glances at the coincidence, but professionalism prevailed. While Jackson examined little Sarah, Abigail helped Emily into a chair and prepared hot tea. "How long has she had the fever?" Jackson asked, checking the child's pulse and respiration. "Started yesterday morning, got worse real fast." Emily watched anxiously as Jackson continued his examination. "My husband's away on a cattle drive. Won't be back for weeks. I didn't know where else to turn." "You did the right thing coming here," Jackson assured her. After a thorough assessment, his diagnosis was clear. Pneumonia, severe but treatable if caught in time. "We need to bring her fever down and ease her breathing. I'll prepare the medications." For the next hour, Jackson and Abigail worked together with the practiced coordination of longtime partners, preparing herbal infusions, applying cool compresses, administering careful doses of medicine from Jackson's supplies. Emily watched with desperate hope as they fought for her daughter's life. By midnight, Sarah's fever had begun to recede, her breathing easier though still labored. She slept, exhausted but stable, on Jackson's bed while Emily dozed in a chair beside her. In the kitchen, Jackson and Abigail spoke in hushed tones. "She mentioned being Wilson's patient," Abigail noted. "Do you think?" "Almost certainly. Her age, her isolation, she would have been an ideal subject for his experiments." Jackson's expression darkened. "And now the community is shunning her, as if she were somehow complicit in his crimes." "There will be others like her," Abigail said thoughtfully. "Women who were victimized without even knowing it, who now face stigma by association. They'll need medical care and understanding." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a decision crystallizing in his mind. "If I take the position in Cheyenne, I could establish a special clinic for Wilson's former patients, monitor them for long-term effects, provide treatment as needed." "It would be important work," Abigail agreed, "a way to continue what Margaret started, protecting women from men like Thornton and Wilson." The mention of Margaret no longer brought pain, Jackson realized. Instead, he felt a sense of continuity, of purpose extending beyond individual lives. "I couldn't do it alone," he said, meeting Abigail's gaze directly. "I'd need a partner, someone with medical knowledge, investigative skills, and a commitment to justice." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Are you offering me a position, Dr. Reed?" "I'm offering you a partnership, Miss Forrester. Professional and—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "And personal, if you're amenable. Not as an obligation or expectation, but as a possibility we might explore together." Abigail was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she smiled, the warmth of it reaching her eyes. "I find that possibility most appealing," she said softly. "Though I warn you, I'm not easily managed." "I would expect nothing less," Jackson replied, returning her smile. "In fact, I'm counting on it." 1 year later, the newly established Reed Clinic for Women's Health stood proudly on a corner lot in Cheyenne. Its doors were open to all women regardless of background or means, with special attention to those who had been under Dr. Wilson's care during his years of secret experimentation. Jackson and Abigail had married in a simple ceremony the previous autumn, with Zeke giving the bride away and Esther Hayes serving as witness. Their partnership, both professional and personal, had quickly become the foundation of a new life neither had expected to find amid the darkness of Thornton's case. Eleanor Prescott visited regularly, bringing updates from the Vigilance Society and referring women who needed specialized care. The federal investigation had expanded to Europe, where several of Thornton's associates had been arrested. Wilson remained in prison, his testimony leading to numerous convictions and the dismantling of much of the network. On a bright spring morning, Jackson stood at the clinic's window, watching as Abigail conducted a health class for young women in the garden, teaching them about their bodies, their rights, and how to recognize when someone might be taking advantage of their trust. Her approach was straightforward, yet compassionate, empowering rather than frightening. Beside him, little Sarah Thornton, now fully recovered and a regular visitor to the clinic, arranged medical instruments with the serious concentration of a 4-year-old playing at doctor. Her mother, Rebecca Thornton, had become the clinic's receptionist, her natural warmth and personal experience making her an ideal first point of contact for nervous patients. As Jackson observed the scene, he thought of Margaret, of how she had died trying to expose the truth about Thornton and his colleagues. The grief remained, a quiet presence rather than the consuming force it had once been. But alongside it had grown something new: purpose, connection, hope. The previous winter, he and Abigail had visited Margaret's grave, now properly marked and tended in the Cheyenne Cemetery. They had placed wildflowers and stood together in respectful silence, acknowledging the path that had led them to each other. She would be proud, Abigail had said simply, of you, of what we're building. Jackson believed she was right. The clinic, the education programs, the ongoing work with authorities to protect women from medical exploitation, all of it honored Margaret's memory far more meaningfully than grief alone could have done. Outside, the last of winter's snow was melting, feeding the earth for new growth. Jackson watched a group of women leave Abigail's class, their faces animated with newfound knowledge and confidence. Among them was a young woman who had arrived at the clinic just days earlier, frightened and alone, now walking taller among newfound friends. The call of snow had brought him to that line shack a year ago, driven by some instinct he couldn't name. Now, as winter retreated and spring emerged, a different call guided his days. The call to heal, to protect, to build something lasting from the ashes of tragedy. Margaret had once told him that a doctor's greatest gift was not skill or knowledge, but presence. The willingness to stand beside those in pain and say, "You are not alone." In the wake of Thornton's evil, that simple truth had become Jackson's creed. No one who came to their door would face their struggles in solitude. No woman's voice would go unheard. No injustice would pass unchallenged. And when the snows fell again, as they inevitably would in the Wyoming winters, they would find not isolation and despair, but a community strengthened by compassion, vigilance, and the courage to face darkness together. Some called it justice. Some called it healing. Jackson Reed simply called it living again.